All right, everyone, here we go. Welcome to The Matrix, Conversations and Transformations, a webinar series from the Department of Critical Theory and Social Justice. I'm Mary Christianakis, and I'm joined by my co-organizers of the series, Professor Hellman, the chair of the department, and Professor Malik Muazzam Daulat. This event is also co-sponsored by the California Immigration Semester, and I'm joined by my colleague, Professor Richard Mora of Sociology. First, a bit about the series. The series focuses on pressing current events and seeks to connect our community with experts, scholars, artists, and the most effective activists. This fall semester, we are running a series on all things immigration. Just a heads up, next Monday at 9:45 a.m., not our usual time, we will host Dr. Amir Estrada, who works in the Center for Transborder Studies at ASU. You can register for the upcoming events and access our YouTube channel where you can watch videos of past events at oxy.edu/matrix. We're also on Instagram and Twitter at CTSJ Oxy for both. And now, without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Richard Mora, who will introduce our esteemed speaker, Ricardo Dominguez.
Ricardo Dominguez is a founding member of Critical Art Ensemble and an associate professor in the Visual Arts Department, and a T2 Q1 principal investigator at the University of California, San Diego. He is co-founder of Electronic Disturbance Theater 1.0, an artivist collective that developed visual sit-in technologies in solidarity with Zapatista communities in Chiapas, Mexico. With Brett Stalbaum, Micha Cardenas, Sara Carroll, and Elle Mehrmand, he co-created Electronic Disturbance Theater 2.0 and co-produced the Transborder Immigrant Tool. He also is co-founder of Particle Group with artists Danielle Luden, Nina Weisman, Sara Carroll, whose art project about nanotoxicology is entitled Particles of Interest, Tales of the Matter Market. Today, Professor Dominguez will be talking to us about electronic disturbances from digital zapatismo to transborder tools. Professor Dominguez.
Hola a todos, es un placer estar aquí con la comunidad. Hello everybody, it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. I'm going to present some gestures that fold into the larger question of the electronic disturbance theater and the definition of electronic civil disobedience. And I'm just going to give you a brief biographical layout in terms of diagramming why the work evolved into this question of the virtual and virtual activism. So I'm going to share right now the screen. And hopefully all of you can see it. And I can bring it up. So I was raised in Las Vegas, Nevada, and there were nuclear bombs that went off almost on a monthly level about every other month. And my mother and I, my mommy and I, would sit there and watch those nuclear bombs go off. And I used to watch a lot of television. And one of the things that nuclear bombs played out in my life as a screenal child, as a young child, was that nuclear bombs was going to create these monsters, which was different than the way it was presented at school, which was that it was patriotic, it was about the future, it would protect us from these unnamed evils. But the schizophrenia of hearing that in school, a patriotic view of nuclear clouds with these monsters on Saturday matinees, they were even very specific. I was, as I said, growing up in Las Vegas, and monsters of the nuclear age were everywhere. So it was difficult for me to begin to navigate what my television horror films on a matinee would tell me about nuclear war and what the schools or a community was telling me about nuclear patriotism, nuclear futurism, if you will. And I ended up as a young artist moving to Tallahassee, Florida, what I call the cultural frontier in the late 70s. And I was very interested in theater. I was interested in political theater, agitprop theater. I was moved by the work of Teatro Campesino, working with Cesar Chavez. I was very interested in the histories of bread and puppet theater, street theater. And there in Tallahassee, Florida, I met a group of young artists like myself who were interested in thinking radical gestures in the cultural frontier. And while we were young, we were also very active in thinking different material forms, different conceptual structures. And so one of the things that came out of this was a group called Critical Art Ensemble. And that's all five of us. I always work in groups of five, a traditional anarchist cell. I started doing micro gestures in the streets. This one is called Are We There Yet? It took place in front of a mall. And what I did is I went into the mall and bought some cheap toys and Burger King crown. And instead of blocking the street or the exit and entrance, I just took out my commodities and played with them. And I never said anything, but very soon community would gather. They would start discussing if I were a danger to them, a Vietnam vet, a lost individual, and the police would come, and it created a disturbance. We were also very interested in poetry. So we wrote a type of poetry called hypertext poetry because we were starting to be fascinated by this question of the new machine that was emerging on a wider scale in the early 80s, 1980s, and that was the digital, the computer system. We didn't have access to computers, but we began to imagine what hypertext, what digital writing would be like. And so we made these handmade poetry books. And out of that came an idea called utopian plagiarism, that we could quickly assemble new ideas by cut and pasting through hypertext new languages. And it just so happened that we were also part of ACT UP, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. In the 80s, mid 80s, many of our friends began to die of a strange unknown disease, an epidemic that came to be known as HIV or AIDS. President Reagan at the time paid no attention because he felt it was a queer or gay male disease only. And so ACT UP, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, we there in Tallahassee, Florida, became a network between ACT UP Miami and ACT UP Atlanta because Tallahassee is the capital. So it was there that Critical Art Ensemble began to think about direct action. We started developing posters for ACT UP, Tallahassee, Healthcare, Not Warfare, the Therapeutic State. We were trying to shift the Reagan administration and Bush administration, Bush Sr., around supporting the development of healthcare, treatment, and support for what was a global disease, not just a gay male disease as was being sort of hysterically promoted. How do we deal with an epidemic? So in trying to bring together the idea of activism, performance, agitprop theater, and on the ground action, having theory hit the ground, as we would say, and using this new idea of utopian plagiarism, we quickly started setting up new forms of activation. Or this is a blood work called a critical virus number 6. Blood was a site of hysteria at that time. So again, very much about the body and critical action. But out of this came a series of investigations. We were reading Henry David Thoreau on civil disobedience from 1848, his text against the Mexican-American War, the expansion of the slave economy in the South. And so we started using utopian plagiarism and started adding the term electronic right before any moment that he said civil disobedience or throwing oneself into the machine. Out of this notion of electronic disturbance and on civil disobedience via Thoreau, we were able to assemble the construct of a matrix in the 80s, in which a performative matrix was going to be assembled and was being assembled, in which data bodies were being established as even more important to virtual capitalism than to the real bodies in the world. So it was soon going to be, at least for us, Critical Art Ensemble, a world in which real bodies protesting in the streets, taking action in the streets, was going to be shut off from the conditions of new power, virtual power. And so that electronic disturbance, this kind of utopian plagiarist idea, was layered over Henry David Thoreau's On Civil Disobedience. And so this abstract idea of electronic disturbance became very specific in the construction of electronic civil disobedience. So what Critical Art Ensemble brought together, the terms of a history of embodied performance, activist work in the streets, agitprop theater, the emergence of ACT UP, coalitions on a global scale, if you will, and this poetic technique of utopian plagiarism in thinking Thoreau in relationship to virtual capitalism and emerging virtual power, we concretize this aesthetic exploration around the notion of electronic civil disobedience. So that using the utopian plagiarism of cut and pasting electronic or digital in front of civil disobedience allowed us to begin to conceptually think, and remember, we didn't have computers at this time in the 80s, was that somehow data bodies would be able to enact the tradition of contestation, social resistance, the series of what Gandhi would call satyagraha, that is the breath of a community in this digital space, enacting the arc of justice, if you will. So this was the theoretical plane that I found myself in early New York in 1990 with another artist named Wolfgang Stahler. We started an internet service provider. I left Tallahassee and went to New York City. And it was here at thing.net that we began, and I began to assemble not just the theory of electronic civil disobedience, but the direct enactment and performance of electronic civil disobedience. And this really grew in relationship to early cyber thinking in the 1990s. That is, the first discourses of cyber war, cyber terrorism, cyber crime began to be assembled by the United States military, and they did not speak of electronic civil disobedience. And so I thought in 1991 that cyber poetics and electronic civil disobedience would disturb these militarized zones of power of cyber terrorism, cyber crime, cyber war. And it was with the 1994 1 Minute After Midnight out of southernmost Chiapas, a group of indigenous rebels ripped through the electronic fabric and established Zapatistas in cyberspace, what we used to call the digital. And it was there in 1991, 1 Minute After Midnight, that I became a digital Zapatista. In New York City, we started the New York Committee for Democracy in New York, or the New York Zapatistas. And I began to assemble a group called the Electronic Disturbance Theater that would bring together digital Zapatismo and electronic civil disobedience as a call against neoliberalism. So I'm now going to go to another presentation that will then take you through the different gestures that came about because of this moment of electronic civil disobedience and digital Zapatismo coming together. These are going to be 4 lines of flight, or what I like to call, along with a group of artists around the world, tactical gestures. My name is Ricardo Dominguez. As you might know, I'm an associate professor, principal investigator, pronouns he, him, his, and I was a member of all these groups that were mentioned earlier. So the first line of flight is electronic civil disobedience. What occurred when digital Zapatismo and the theory and practice of electronic civil disobedience came together. So as I said, it was 1994, January 1st, right as NAFTA, the free trade zone agreement between Mexico, the United States, and Canada came about. And the Zapatistas ripped through the electronic fabric, even though they didn't have computers, they didn't have telephones, they did not even speak Spanish as the dominant language. These were indigenous communities. But because they were able, through a series of networks upon which I communicated with, we were able to create a global digital Zapatista movement within 6 hours, 8 hours of their emergence. The next day, the New York Times said, the first postmodern revolution. It was based on the idea that data bodies were beginning to become manifest in this larger network. And that electronic civil disobedience, at least for me, would become a key aesthetic in establishing an agitprop theater that would promote Zapatismo against neoliberalism and the sort of virtual capital that was capturing the planet, and for the voices of 500 years of resistance against colonization and against the colonization of this new neoliberal paradigm that was wholly about the trafficking in human beings as economic projects, and certainly data as a virtual capitalist project. So one of the ways that Electronic Disturbance Theater established a connection was through the Zapatista Floodnet, the first virtual sit-in technology that automated actions based on the number of people who participated in these virtual sit-ins against the Mexican government, primarily Presidente Cedillo, but also against Washington, the White House, the Clinton White House, global communities worldwide who were trying to shut down through paramilitary means and direct military means the right of an indigenous community for autonomy and respect within the Mexican Constitution, as the Zapatistas called for. So I'm going to show you how and share with you how the Zapatista Floodnet system worked. And it was online in the early days on a browser called Netscape, before Chrome or any of these things. And so you would join a virtual sit-in that was on a browser. It reloaded up here, like the Matrix Reload Volume 2. We were already doing it. We hit it over and over. It would count how many people came and disturb President Cedillo's website. But the other thing we did was do 404 files, or files not found, and say, is democracy, we would write in democracy into the system. Sorry, I'm trying to see, there it is, democracy. And we would upload it into the Mexican website, and it would say democracy not found. This is 404 files. So part of Electronic Disturbance Theater's formation of digital Zapatismo and electronic civil disobedience was that we would not be anonymous. Our data bodies and real bodies would be connected. I would say, I'm Ricardo Dominguez, I'm Carmen Karasik, I am Stefan Ray, I am Brett Stalbaum, the artist who collaborated in developing the Zapatista Floodnet. And we are using the weight of a community to disturb it within the structure and frame of what a browser does. That is a reload function. It knocks on the window of a server. The server says, what information do you want? And it gives you that information. Only here, there would be hundreds and thousands and hundreds of thousands knocking on that reload. Also, we were not trying to get secrets from the Mexican government website. We were not trying to get secrets from the White House or the Pentagon. We were just pointing to what did not exist within those systems to begin with, that democracy did not exist. Justice was not found in these systems. So it just created a negative dialectic that extracted the aesthetics of what was not there. And so this created the first acts of digital disturbances that allowed a long-term presence of developing what came to be known as hacktivism. Sorry, I'm bringing up the wrong thing. Hold on. Sorry, I have to upload it here. All right, it should be coming up. So that was the first line of flight, the connection across borders of the Zapatistas using communication, email, and multiple language, even though they had no connections themselves to create actions. The Department of Defense got very angry when we did an action against them. And they said if the Electronic Disturbance Theater wasn't illegal, it was certainly immoral. I think that brings up another element of our actions, which is not about the legal or illegal, but about ethics, the arc of justice. That is the moral versus the immoral. This is another line of flight. This is a flight in which we delay immigrant and refugee deportation flights. So in 2000 through 2001, the German government was using private class airlines like Lufthansa to deport refugees and immigrants. They would mummify them in the public seats, and they would put a motorcycle mask over them so that their shouts and screams and pain wouldn't be disturb the paying public. And so I was invited by the deportation class group in Germany to bring civil disobedience and electronic disturbance theater, transparent data body, real body actions to take down Lufthansa and to make the world know what the German government was doing to refugees and immigrants. We dressed like Lufthansa individuals working for Lufthansa. We would pass information about what Lufthansa was doing and the digital actions that would take it down. All very transparent. We let all newspapers know that we were going to do an online demonstration against deportation and the use of these things, and why we were doing it. So this free online protest, it took about a month to set up. We did it on the day the stockholders were meeting at Lufthansa, and we were able to shut down the main website of Lufthansa. The German Lufthansa's pilot union signed an agreement they would not fly a deportation class plane again. So did the stewards, and the stockholders also voted against working with the German government on deportation class flights. Now, the use of electronic civil disobedience was in this particular case around defending the rights of refugees and immigrants. A number of them died because they were asphyxiated because of this process. And so unlike the digital Zapatista action, which was about unifying data bodies and real bodies from Chiapas across the world, this line of flight, this delay of the flight of deportation was a gathering of data bodies to shut down the flight of real bodies. And so that was an interesting element. The other thing that came about was electronic civil disobedience legal or illegal? We went before the lower court of Germany in Frankfurt, and they said it was illegal, that it was cyber terrorism or a cyber crime. We would have to go to jail for 10 years and pay a lot of money, euros. But the higher court of Frankfurt overturned the lower court and said that digital civil disobedience, electronic civil disobedience, was a social and civil right of the community. So that was an interesting outcome of this particular action. The third line of flight I would like to look at is flight facilitation. So I was hired to be a professor here at the University of California, San Diego by Cal IT 2, California Information Technology 2, also known as Qualcomm Institute now, in 2004, to develop electronic civil disobedience as a theory and practice, expanding it in 2004 to hacktivism, the joining of hacking and activism together. And I had never really lived on the border in a deep way. And so it was a territory that I really needed to start to know. What became apparent was that the long history of the US-Mexico border was this very precise moment in 1994 where Operation Gatekeeper was established. And there was this movement to prevention through deterrence, developed here at UCSD, at Sandia Labs, that we could create a pressure valve to move immigrants and refugees into dangerous, ecologically desert biomes that would guarantee killing a large number of them and only let a limited amount through for the purposes of cheap, illegal or illegally marked undocumented labor. So it became apparent that NGOs were developing ways of leaving water for these desert wanderers. And it was also at that moment in 2000 that GPS, global positioning systems, were first offered to the civilian population. And so working with artist Brett Stalbaum, longtime member and founder of Electronic Disturbance Theater 1.0 back in the 90s, also professor here at UCSD, we started Electronic Disturbance Theater 2.0 that would look at a geopoetic system, geolocation, as a way to support wanderers in the desert placed under this prevention through deterrence, ecologically, what is called the Devil's Highway, to support NGOs with these new technologies. And so we were soon joined by poet and scholar Amy Sara Carroll, Micha Cardenas, a transmedia artist and MFA at that time, and Elle Mehrmand, a mixed reality sound artist, an MFA at that time here. We developed the Transborder Immigrant Tool, a geopoetic tool, because it not only directed desert wanderers through the desert, but gave them directions through poetry and design, ways to get to water, ways to navigate this dangerous territory on the cheapest available GPS-enabled system, a Motorola i455. The poetry was desert specific. How do you survive? It was taken from military manuals across the world. It also had a witching tool that would vibrate if you could not read the little screen, and direct you in many languages for sustenance. And so for us, sustenance was both about coordination and support against dehydration. It was about a movement and protection of refugees and immigrants, but it was also imagining a geopoetic construction that allowed sustenance of a conceptual quality that our communities, as undocumented as refugees and immigrants, are a part of. We're not just labor, zombies cleaning up after a society like the United States, a system of neoliberal capital, but creative systems of new societies. And so this embodiment and was processed by letting communities on both sides of the border know that the Transborder Immigrant Tool was available and what it would do. So by by 2010, when we were ready to give these tools out to immigrants at Casa Migrante in Tijuana, we had been working with NGOs here on the border who leave water cache like Water Station Inc. and Border Angels. And so we had the water caches, everything was ready for testing. The right wing started hearing about the project and they got very angry. But they were most angry, not that we were helping the desert wanderers to water, helping them survive the desert biome as a killing zone, but that it had poetry, poetry that would dissolve the border, they said. And so this poetry had to be shut down. So at that time, I and the rest of Electronic Disturbance Theater were placed under investigation by Duncan Hunter, Bill Bray, Republican congressman here in San Diego, University of California Office of the President, and my own university tried to detenure me. The FBI Cyber Crimes Division investigated us around the poetry and the gesture. So I had to find different ways of contestation through the system. And so I got a lot of lawyers, and at the end we won. And even the lawyers were fascinated by this gesture, and they did it all pro bono. So that was a really interesting moment on the Transborder Immigrant Tool. The last line of flight that I'll look at are recent work that I've been doing with undergraduate students in the last few years, and that is flight patterns. As you might know, San Diego and the University of California are at the center of Drone Valley. We produce over 80% of all the drone technology being used globally, especially for purposes of military targeting and signature strikes, which are a way of saying killing. So from George W. Bush to President Obama to our current president, and I'm sure in the future, drones and unmanned aerial vehicles have become part of a highly militarized and highly economically valuable center of production. And this is Drone Valley. And UCSD, my university, is a key developer. So with my students in 2014, we began to do a project called Drones at Home. Along with Professor Jordan Crandall and Professor Sheldon Brown, we established a year-long series of investigations with students. And so it went all the way from photoshopping signs that we would eventually leave around campus to begin to alert individuals to where our university had changed from a Cold War university to a war on terrorism university, specifically around unmanned aerial vehicles that were also being sold to Homeland Security to do surveillance across the US-Mexico border, and indeed within the United States itself. What happened was that a crash occurred at the iconic Dr. Seuss library here that you see in the background. And everybody was quite frightened. But General Atomics, one of our partners, is right across the street. and they are always doing projects around the Predator drone, or recently the Sky Guardian system that they were going to launch this summer. And so because of this crash, the University of California Office of the President called on the development of a Center for Drone Policy and Ethics. You can see our Triton here holding the drone, and I was made the lead principal investigator to investigate and not only the drone crash here on campus, but to establish the Center for Drone Policy and Ethics. Here I am, appointed. We discovered that there was a lot of pro unmanned aerial vehicle communities here at UCSD, and they started putting up signs around campus, Tritons for drones, and we decided to talk to them and try to have a formal town hall as the Center for Drone Policy and Ethics to see why they would be driven to support unmanned aerial vehicles for the use of military purposes, and UCSD's involvement in all of this. We then discovered there was a whole nother community who were against the killer economy, drones, Tritons against drones. So we brought them all together. And it was soon discovered that this drone crash was really an art project that we, myself and other artists like Alex Rivera, the filmmaker, had developed in order to bring to the foreground that we as a university needed a center for drone policy and ethics. We needed to be concerned about this military-driven economy that defines the research at our Research One University. It is, again, a university that might be considered a war on terrorism university. So this last element that came out of this project is a new project I am working on, which is a copy of the Predator drone at 1/3 of the size, and it is called the palindrome because the border is the same forwards as backwards, and it's a search and sing system. So this palindrome will chase Homeland Security drones, and it will sing to them via various radio waves, this poetry and of Ansaldúa, Gloria Ansaldúa, the beats of Nortec corridos, the voices of the undocumented and refugees waiting at the border, and sing to those Critch, Nevada unmanned aerial vehicle pilots in their remote bases and give them a sense of what the border is. It is a cultural zone, an aesthetic zone, a zone of invention of futures to come, and not a zone of elimination, not a zone that defines them as less than nothing. So that's the project I am doing right now. It always takes me a long time to develop projects. So those are the lines of flight around electronic disturbance, electronic civil disobedience, and some gestures. Thank you for your time and attention. And now I welcome questions.
Great, everyone. I just want to remind you to use the Q&A for questions. And while you populate the questions, Professor Mora and I will, and anybody else who's on, will start us off. So I actually was alarmed the other day when I read that Google is going to be supplying artificial intelligence access to our government for monitoring the border. And I'm wondering if you've heard of that, and if this kind of intervention would be able to use that sort of disruptive, artistic sort of technology, right? Hacktivism.
Yes, it has been a concern since I arrived here. The history of automated surveillance systems, right, from sensors on the border to Homeland Security, drones. And there has been a long conversation in establishing a digital domain that is specific in its gathering of intelligence, again, several layers of surveillance. Many times these systems have failed, and they go back actually to the Vietnam War here on the US border. But as we move into this new layer of artificial intelligence that Google Alphabet is doing, that Palantir is doing, the product of PayPal, Amazon is also involved. So you have large scale Silicon Valley, wired ideology connecting a way to capture and the movements of communities on the border in a very, very data-centric manner. That is, as data bodies, right? And that goes for all of us. So there's a very good group called Mi Gente, who have been doing deep research on the economic contracts that elements like the Palantir app, which is being used by a number of police on the ground, right? Everyday police in San Diego, to border containment groups, homeland security, and they're sharing extreme data. And this can also happen to on the very things that we're doing right now, like Zoom. The gathering of data as a term of surveillance capitalism and cyber war are I think, key factors. So yes, I've been trying to think, how can we create electronic disturbances around these platforms like Amazon, like Palantir, like Google, who are assembling all around us a capture of all data bodies, especially around immigrants and refugees and anybody who's just unwanted. It could be from members of Black Lives Matter. It could be from nonviolent protesters. There's nobody who's kind of outside of that. So yes, I am thinking about that. How do you delete tech ICE or ICE tech specifically, right? And I can give you one idea we have, and that is that a lot of people have Alexis and Siri on their systems, and they work as part of this gathering of data. You know, people have Alexis or Siri's or any of these things. So we were looking back to the Patty Hearst case, where Patty Hearst was kidnapped. She was an art history student, and then the Symbionese Liberation Army, through a series of kind of long-term, what we would now call brainwashing techniques, convinced Patty Hearst to join them, you know, in a fight for revolution. So we were thinking of kidnapping Alexis, the AI, and questioning Alexis, the artificial unit, what it knows about the relationship of Amazon to these data captures specifically being used by ICE. And can the AI join us, right? That is robots for the people, not against the people. And so anyway, so again, how do you aesthetically play with those interventions? I'll stop there. And I'm sorry, I lost your question. I think you muted yourself, Mary.
Oh, sorry about that. We have some questions from the participants here. Have staff or students continued to be resistant towards your projects? If so, how do you deal with the resistance? And I find it very interesting and shocking, this kind of work. So how do you deal with the resistance? Because I could imagine there are various positions in your university.
Well, you know, I guess the thing that really helped me fight the university and my institution, as well as local and government national if and beyond, is that as an artist, I've been doing this practice for a very long time in various ways. And I was hired by this university, and I did it in a very transparent manner. This is my research. This is what I'm going to do, right? I'm going to do this research against you because I believe it has to be contestational, right? That is, there's a long history in art of institutional critique. And I was going to create border-based technologies to disturb the border. So I did this in what is called my job talk, right? And I did this at a new transdisciplinary space called Cal IT2. And they all said, oh, this is excellent research, Ricardo. We want to know about hacktivism. We want to know about institutional critique. How are you going to disturb the border? And the thing is that when I came to this university, technology is a fetish. So all that this institution heard was technology, technology, technology. They didn't even hear what the content was. They just heard electronic. They did not hear disturbance. They did not hear border. So that when the institution got angry and responded in multiple ways, the main lawyer of the lawyers that I had, because I had a labor lawyer, a criminal lawyer, an art lawyer, immigrant lawyer, electronic law lawyer, I went with labor lawyer because I was hired based on this research, and accomplishing the goals of this research was to disturb the university at multiple levels as my research. So in the end, the university said, okay, just don't do it for 2 years. And they gave me tenure the year before for these very things.
Oh my God.
So I guess what I would say is that I'm accepted in the university because from the beginning, I said, this is my research. And this is how I'll evaluate that research, and you will. The quality of disturbance institutionally as well as outside. I don't know if that answers the question.
I believe it does.
Mm-hmm.
So we have another question. In what ways do you try to avoid cyber surveillance? Is it ever fully, it is even fully impossible when, as you said, especially now in a time when everything is online?
Mm-hmm. I think this is a great question. I think the generations that I'm teaching right now are deeply interested in creating opacity, camouflage of data bodies. How does one extract themselves from cultural and surveillance capitalism? I think this is a really important key question. And I think it's an aesthetic of opacity that needs to be investigated. I have nothing against that research, but I come from a tradition of disturbing the aesthetics of transparency. Remember I said electronic civil disobedience was a kind of Gandhian satyagraha, because people would say, Ricardo, sure, you can do data electronic civil disobedience, but when your body is on the ground in the street, the police can come and hit you, right? So we thought in the 90s, well, we had to be transparent. The police and the authorities had to know it was Ricardo Dominguez data body, Carmen Karasik. We were the ones doing it. Here is the code. And we would tell the Department of Defense, we're coming next Friday. If you have any problems, call me. We're going to do a virtual sit-in. So it was transparency, right? But after 9/11, it became clear that the governmental system loved transparency, right? The banks were transparent, supposedly. Obama's website was transparent. Everybody was transparent. So then we said, when we developed the Transborder Immigrant Tool, well, the students are saying, you must be opaque. You must be camouflaged. You can't be transparent because the government knows about that, right? Or the systems of power. So the question for us then became, well, we want the user, the immigrant, the undocumented, the wanderers of the desert in this devil's highway, not to appear under surveillance, right? They shouldn't be manifest. but we, Electronic Disturbance Theater, should stay transparent. So we decided that the aesthetic of the Transborder Immigrant Tool would be the aesthetic of translucency, where you would know who the founders and makers and code from us, but you wouldn't know who was using it, the immigrant, undocumented, or wandering body. So it was a way for us to deal with that. The final element. I grew up in the 80s and we saw what surveillance had done to our brothers and sisters and trans community in the 60s and 70s. It drove them crazy, right? There was the Contelpro where the FBI made the Black Panthers angry at the Brown Berets. They created deep schizophrenia and paranoia because they were being surveyed. So one of the things that we decided in the 80s was we didn't care. You know, if the data engines want to spend their endless hours looking at what I do, so be it, right? We weren't going to be driven insane by surveillance and be paranoid about it because they were surveying us. We don't need to be paranoid about it, right? They are doing it. So I guess that's my choice. But it doesn't have to be the choice of the aesthetic research of those who are concerned and should be concerned about algorithmic bias, racism, and the way these algorithms work, right? It's Jim Crow code. So the very conditions of code already carry the weight of all the worst of our history. So I think student researchers, artists have a lot to be concerned about. It's just I'm lucky enough to not care. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't care and shouldn't be concerned.
Can you just building on that, can you talk about the way that data collection might be harmful to immigrants and the vulnerabilities relatedly?
Well, the concern about data capture of immigrants is more that they're erased from the prospect of being citizens, of rights and representation. If you look at the way the immigrants and refugees are being kept in Tijuana, they're being forced to write their names on paper lists that they themselves have to write. Children are being separated from parents and no data is being kept. So what we're facing is a ripping of data as citizenship and representation and rights of refugee status, and they're being erased. So that's one level of the way data capture works, deletion and inhumanity, right? The other level is that the algorithms, the bias algorithms, are shifting the way people are being judged. There are literally courts being driven right now, not by human beings, but by algorithms who judge you the same way they judge your credit rating, right? And there's already algorithmic biases around those who are not wanted. So you go into a doctor's office, a hospital, emergency room, the data will read you as within an anti-Black stream. This person doesn't have the funding or what have you. So it's not just how they capture your data, how they use your data, but how they target that data to frame who you are and then also place you under erasure or deletion of no longer having the right to health care, the right to citizenship or representation, or the rights of refugee. So it's not just what they capture, but what they refuse to aggregate, right? I guess that's my long-winded answer. I'm sorry.
Yes, that's actually terrifying, all of
Mhm.
that. Yeah, and inhumane, that kind of erasure.
Mhm.
Let's see. We have a question. Do you feel like the increased reliance on technology for communication during the COVID-19 pandemic has increased government surveillance and monitoring of immigrant communities?
I feel that the layers of pandemic capture and use of technology is a moment in which we as a community who have been part of an accelerationist condition, right? That is, the data body and real body performative matrix has been sort of zooming along, from early days of email to Facebook to Insta, it's been growing. But what the pandemic has done is allowed us to critically look and see and take a measure of how these systems are functioning, right? And so, yes, there is a pandemic capture of data. There is a pandemic reliance on data, Zoom, for instance, right, to communicate. But also we've been able to see instances of documenting the enactment of violence, like George Floyd and many, many others. We have been able to see the way algorithmic bias is playing itself out, not just in the streets, not just in the embodied space, but in the digital space. So the pandemic for me is, again, a schizoanalytic space of ramping up the worst of what these systems are capable of, but at the same time, I think allowing us to see the very fractures that have brought us to this point. That is systemic racism, anti-Blackness, the political equator that continues to, 500 years of colonization and elimination. Yeah, it's the pandemic has allowed us as a community to track the fault lines of this acceleration. And so the questions for the generations after me is, what are the social disturbances that can hit the ground co-equal with the generations of knowledge from, Thoreau, Gandhi, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the queer movement, all these layers that are so important, right? Farm worker futurism, as important. I'll stop there.
I've been hogging the conversation. I'd like to invite my co-moderators to ask your questions or chime in.
So there is a question from Anonymous. Do you see a change in the attitude toward your work with the new generation coming in and starting college?
I think there are different points of conversation. I mean, they look at me like, dude, you mean you didn't have the internet? What is that about? You walked around, what is that about? So I think there is generational differences and there is generational ethics that are building, and I think really strong ways. And I think they have a different critique and play with technology that I am always learning from. So I guess in the best of all worlds, I hope of an intergenerational, intersectional sharing of these knowledge bases and gestures and aesthetic practices. But like any community, you can only take those maps of the generations before you so far, and then you can say, here be dragons. And this is where we will take those processes in history. And yeah, I mean, I was young too, and I said, hey, forget it. I'm doing data bodies, so who knows what they'll do now. That was my, place. So I think knowledge sharing, what we're doing here, I think is important. And what you guys as a community do where you are, that's important. Intergenerational, contestational knowledge sharing. And hopefully they'll take us further than we possibly had the power to do. Anyway. Que viva Zapata, that's what I say. Que viva los Zapatistas. Because if there's anybody we can learn from, are the indigenous in Chiapas, Mexico, who have fought for more than 500 years for their autonomy, their rights, their vision, and they're intergalactic, right? El intergaláctico. So the indigenous are messages from the future, and I think that's a space that we can learn from as well. Because we always imagine the future as being technologically the frame of that future. but it might not be, as far as I'm concerned. There is much to learn about indigenous science, labor science, women's science, and society. I don't know. I'm just, I have to go to another class in a moment, so I'm getting a bit colorized here in the line. One
Thank
last
you so
question.
much.
Oh yeah, okay.
I was just gonna thank you so much. I think we should end on that inspirational note. Thank you for joining our webinar. We will be posting this for those of you that are watching. If you'd like to be inspired again and watch it again, I know I'm going to. There's so much information, and share it with your friends. Professor Dominguez, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
We are
Be
inspired.
Well. Have a happy Halloween. Don't forget to vote. Adios.
Adios.